Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
So help me God. I, Mark David Smith, do solemnly swear that I will give you the best of my research on whatever I'm talking about today. What am I talking about today? All right. Let's see. Last week we talked about Article 1, Section 9, Clause 6, the No Preference Clause. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obligated to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. We talked about export preferences and port preferences. And so if you want to hear this specific, my research on this specific article, you're welcome to go to messianicalamnetwork.com, and there you'll find the link to Contemplating the Constitution, and you can hear all of our past. I think there's like 30 some going on 40 recordings now, videos now on the Constitution. So this week I give you my research on Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, and there's two parts of this. There's 7A and 7B. There's a lot on the internet that you can find to research this if you're interested. But let me read this first to get started. Article 1, Section 9, Clause A reads, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time." What we have in this instance, this clause, is called the Appropriations Clause, and it's also the Statement and Accounts Clause. Pretty basically, because you have two sections here. The first one that I read, talking about no money shall be drawn, is the Appropriation Clause, and then a regular statement and account makes that the Statement and Account Clause. The first half of Clause 7 being defined as appropriation for our use in this, of course, the definition of appropriation for our use in this article is a sum of money or total assets devoted to a special purpose. So pretty much says it all. It's just a sum of money. It's just an amount given for a specific purpose. In your household, say one person takes care of the money in the household and something is needed to buy to help out the household, then you appropriate that amount of money to a certain person in that household to go buy that product. It's just as simple as that, and it's just the way that Congress works. For my base research outline, I'll be using a couple of articles, one from the constitution.congress.org called Constitution Annotated, and the other from constitutioncenter.org. The article from Constitution Annotated starts off by saying the restriction on drawing money from the Treasury was intended as a restriction upon the disbursing authority of the Executive Department of Congress, and means simply that no money can be paid out of the Treasury unless it has been appropriated by an act of Congress. Congress may recognize and pay a claim of an equitable, moral, or honorary nature when it directs a specific sum to be paid to a certain person. Neither the Secretary of the Treasury nor any court has discretion to determine whether the person is entitled to receive it. The court has recognized that Congress the court has also recognized that Congress has wide discretion with regard to the extent to which it may prescribe details of expenditures for which it appropriates funds, and has approved the frequent practice of making lump sum appropriations. And in an article from constitutioncenter.org, written by Kate Smith, who is a Lafayette Foster professor of law at Yale School of Law, she writes, "The Constitution places the power of the purse in Congress. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In specifying the activities on which public funds may be spent, Congress defines the contours of federal power. This requirement of legislative appropriation before public funds are spent is at the foundation of our constitutional order. The Appropriations Clause, which is the first part of Clause 7, is not technically a grant of legislative power, because pursuant to the necessary and proper clause, which would be Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, we've covered in past sessions, Congress clearly has the power to specify the objects, amounts, and timing of federal spending, even if there were no appropriations clause. So the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 actually covers this, even if we weren't, this part of it, even if they weren't written into this clause. If Congress could not limit the executive's withdrawing of funds from the Treasury, then the constitutional grants of power to Congress to raise taxes and to borrow money would be for naught, because the executive could, executive being the president, could effectively compel taxing and borrowing by spending at will. So in other words, what they're saying here is that the president withdrawing funds from the Treasury has to be gone through Congress to do whatever he wants to do. He can't just go in and tell Congress, I'm going to do this for this reason. One of those example that comes to my mind on that is during the Iraq War, when we were supposed to go to Congress to get approval to get the money to fight the war, our then president decided to just go to war. And that was a huge issue. Everybody just followed him and we went to war. But that it was also the big issue based on this clause, the Appropriations Clause. In other words, he did not go through the proper channels, so he violated the Constitution by not getting the money from Congress or them approving that. So anyway, and that comes from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2. You can go back and read those. They go right along with this. The Appropriations Clause creates a legislative duty that Congress exercise control and assume responsibility over the federal fiscal year. Congress's power of the purse is at the foundation of our Constitution's separations of powers, a constitutionally mandated check on executive power. Once again, that's why we have it in the Constitution, so that the president can't just go take money from the Treasury and say, tell his secretary, go get this money, we're going to go do this. they've got to have a constitutionally mandated check on executive power. The Appropriations Clause would appear to enjoin the president and federal agencies to spend funds only as appropriated by Congress. Once again, even where the president believes that federal spending is urgently needed, spending in the absence of appropriations is constitutionally prohibited. It's exactly what we're talking about. Where an emergency exists, a president may decide that principles more fundamental than the Constitution's appropriations requirement justify spending. For instance, what I just talked about with President Bush and the war on Iraq, he decided that that was an emergency. Also, for instance, at the outbreak of the Civil War, with the nation itself at risk, Lincoln ordered the expenditure of $2 million in federal funds before appropriations were funded. He just ordered it to come in. $2 million. Can you imagine back in those days when, I mean, we're talking 100 some years ago, when money was, $1 million was everything. I mean, people couldn't imagine $1 million like today. They can't imagine $1 trillion. Even billions today are just slightly mentioned. They're like no big deal to say $1 billion anymore. But Lincoln did that $2 million, which today price is probably more like $2 billion. Anyway, so this is supposed to be a check on the executive office by Congress, yet still, even though it's not in the Constitution, the president, the executive office, will invoke his power, and as long as it's done, they don't come against him. Interesting, we're impeaching a president for something he didn't even do right now, and this kind of thing was done, and they never even... anyway, going on. Despite the imperative of the Appropriations Clause, Congress itself is constitutionally obligated to provide funding necessary for the president to undertake executive powers specifically granted in Article 2. This would be to receive ambassadors, act as commander-in-chief, negotiate treaties, and grant pardons, and the like, which seem to be, except for the act as commander-in-chief, doesn't seem like it should cost a whole lot. If Congress fails to provide necessary funds, then the grants of power to the president just do not work. Scholars disagree on the extent to which Congress may use appropriations limitations to control the president's exercise of discretion in carrying out his or her duty to execute the law, especially in the area of national security, though we all agree that Congress may not, under the guise of exercising the power of the purse, interfere with indispensable executive or judicial functions, nor may the president frustrate congressional mandates by refusing to spend directed funds. The constitutional processes for resolving disagreements or even deadlocks may well be political, but no federal court has ever ordered Congress to appropriate funds for the executive branch or for the judicial branch, whereas federal courts have exercised authority to direct state fiscal operations in order to effectuate federal constitutional guarantees, such as the school busing, racial segregation cases. On rare occasions, as in the case of Train versus City of New York City of 1975, federal courts have also intervened to say that a president has no authority to withhold funds. An appropriation is often thought as the specification of an amount of money, but an appropriation is more than a limitation to how much money may be spent. The appropriations required by the Constitution also must specify the powers, activities, and purposes for which the funds may be used. The specification of these objects is sometimes in an Appropriations Act itself, but more usually is the non-appropriations legislation establishing federal agencies or continuing particular programs, often called authorization acts rather than appropriations. Critically, the more creation of an agency or authorization of an activity does not by itself permit expenditure of federal funds. Spending requires another kind of authorization, and that is an appropriation. Congress. So basically what they're saying is there's a difference between authorizing the money and actually coming up with the money, making sure that the money is there. So many times the two words get misused in what they're doing. So, you may not authorize it, but the money's there to take, and they take it anyway. And sometimes it's authorized and then they don't use the money. So it can be used vice versa. Congress has long codified this object requirement, requiring that appropriations shall be applied only to the objects for which the appropriations were made, except as otherwise provided by law. Except as otherwise provided by law refers primarily to a variety of statutes that give executive agencies limited authority to reprogram line items with an appropriation under certain conditions. This practice does not contravene or conflict with the Appropriations Clause because reprogramming authority effectively expands the objects for which the appropriations are made. So what we're talking about here is that if I'm part of Congress and we've decided that we want to do a certain thing for a certain community, and we have to fill out an Appropriations Act defining all the things that we're going to do and how we're going to use that money. But yet when we get the money, we actually we don't use it for these things and use it over here for other things. You can't do that. You have to be sure that everything is accounted for within the act or the document that you present to Congress that you're using that money for. So what they're saying is that what people will do is they submit that writ of what they want it for, and then they reprogram the objects into using them for something else. Another statute codifies the concept that appropriations must be spent within the time period specified by Congress. The Constitution specifically provides that the duration of appropriations for the Army must be limited to 2 years. We find that specifically in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12. We covered in past sessions. From the first Congress, operating funds for federal agencies have usually been appropriated annually, but larger capital projects may have longer appropriation durations. So things have changed over the years from when the first Congress put all this together, but it still works the same way. There are a variety of other forms of federal spending authority besides statutes called appropriations. For instance, Congress has often authorized agencies to obligate federal funds which have not yet been appropriated. Such obligation authority is necessary because federal agencies, subject to annual appropriations, often must enter into multi-year contracts. There is no violation of the appropriations clause as long as the funds are not paid until appropriated. So what they're talking about is that it's real easy to appropriate funds and then sit on them to use them at a later time. So they put a time limit on the whatever appropriations act you submit. This has to be used in this specific amount of time. And as long as funds are not paid within the appropriated time, you're fine. But Congress can take those funds back if you're not using them. In other statutes, Congress has indefinitely authorized federal agencies to spend treasury funds or special purpose taxes, fees, or forfeitures without separate appropriation of such funds. Such backdoor spending, as it's often called, is usually without limitation as to amount or duration of spending. Payment of interest on the national debt has been indefinitely and permanently appropriated since 1847. Indefinitely meaning no limitation as to amount, and permanently meaning no limitations as to duration. And what this is really saying is that we can borrow money and never pay it back. Never being permanently, pay being indefinitely it back. Statutory entitlement programs such as Social Security, unemployment payments, and certain agriculture subsidies are usually funded by an indefinite and permanent appropriation. So basically what they've done is they've set up things like Social Security, unemployment payments, and certain agricultural subsidies can draw that money as they need it. And they make sure that there is no time limit on it. They have to be able to keep that going as long as the money is there. So I think we all know that Social Security money is will keep going on and on. But if we run out of money, then those of us who draw Social Security won't get it anymore. Okay, let's see. The constitutional function of appropriations made by law, which is a legislative check on the executive branch and the exercise of federal authority, is performed by the creation of the entitlement program and by future Congresses in setting the rates and amounts of agency receipts and payments. At times, Congress has created spending authority not only without amount or time limitations, but also arguably without an effective object limitation, where, for instance, the agency has broad discretionary authority in some particular policy area. In such circumstances, although spending has been approved by Congress, it is not clear that the functional purposes of the Appropriations Clause have been met. There is, for instance, an indefinite permanent appropriation for national intelligence activities, the objects of which are particularly specified in federal statutes. Says itself. One questionable form of spending authority is open-ended authority to receive and spend donations and gifts, which Congress has granted to a variety of federal agencies, including the State Department. It's just like the donations and gifts. There's There's no ending on it. It's all the time. It's forever, and it has no limit to it. So they can just whatever they want to give on donations and gifts, $2 billion, and take it right out of the treasury to give to somebody for some reason. It's there. It's just wide open. Loan guarantees and insurance schemes like mortgages backed by the Federal Home Loan Banks function outside the appropriations process, notwithstanding the federal financial liability incurred. Until recently, the Federal Reserve was the only federal agency that has been given permanent plenary authority to set its own budget without congressional oversight. This approach has been justified because of the need to have a politically independent agency in charge of monetary fiscal policy. It says itself. Congress effectively gave the same authority to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by requiring the Federal Reserve to fund it. Therefore, there have been recent efforts to subject that agency to the usual annual appropriations process. So what they're talking about here in all of this, in the appropriations, is that it is a way to get authorization, approval. You submit, whoever you are, the president or House of Representatives, the senators, Congress itself, all of that, come up with a project and they want to fund that, then you get authorization through an Appropriations Act, and then that money comes out of there, but it is, by what they're doing, they're keeping track of all of this. Now, that's the second part of this Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Is Part B is more aptly called the Clause 7B, the Statement and Accounts Clause, which complements the requirement appropriation. And as we read at the beginning, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. Like the appropriations requirement, this requirement states not a power, but a legislative duty that has been interpreted to require an annual budget. Justice Story was an American lawyer and jurist who served on the Supreme Court of the United States from 1812 to 1845. He is most remembered for his magisterial commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. He wrote about this specific clause, and I quote, excuse me, "The power to control and direct the appropriations constitutes a most useful and salutary check upon profusion and extravagance, as well as upon corrupt influence and public speculation. And to make the responsibility complete and perfect, a regular account of the receipts and expenditures is required to be published, that the people may know what money is expended and for what purposes and by what authority," unquote. Since the founding era, Congress has largely delegated its duty under the Statement and Accounts Clause to executive branch agencies such as the Treasury Department and the Office of Management and Budget. Those agencies have failed to include or report in full on a variety of backdoor federal spending programs, federal insurance liabilities, and spending and borrowing by semi-autonomous federal entities. Certain national security spending is also excluded from the annual budget process. While the Congressional Budget Office and Government Accountability Office seek to provide further budget accountability as agents of the legislative branch, the Statement and Accounts Clause has de facto fallen in the purview of the executive or the president. The two requirements discussed here are not self-enforcing and likely do not judicially are not likely judicially enforceable. They are only as good as Congress's determination to abide by them. So what we have is the ability to appropriate, meaning that a sum of money set aside for a specific thing, object, or progress that you want to do if you're in Congress or the President of the United States. And then it's supposed to be held accountable. Once it is approved, it's authorized, it should be held accountable. But as they're saying, what I'm actually saying is that if it's never ending, it doesn't really have a time limit, and you don't have a set amount. If it's either one of those different things, which should be in every Appropriations Act that they put together, if it's not there, then it's not kept track of, and there goes our money, and that's about it right there. But anyway, there was Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7A and B, and how all that works. And I hope it was interesting to you. It's always very interesting to me. I wish 30 years ago I had started looking into this 30, 40 years ago and learned about this. I would be a smarter human. That's all there is to it. So once again, I hope you're enjoying this as we contemplate the Constitution. And this is my research. Once again, there is a massive amount of information about every single item in the Constitution out there. It's been written about over and over and over again, and there's a lot of documented facts about it over and over and over again on the internet. You just have to look it up. One of the best ways to do it is just put, for instance, if you want to know more about what I just showed you my research on, if you'll type in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, just type that in there. You'll see page after page after page come up on all of that, all the information on that and what different people have put together, including government document sites. The government itself has got a lot of detailed instruction on each and every clause, article, section, amendment that there is in the Constitution. So anyway, I don't even have a clue how far along we are. I haven't even looked to see what else is there. We're just going through it piece by piece by piece. And so there you have it. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Next week, I'll give you my research on the final clause of Section 9, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, which reads, "No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office or of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present enrollment office or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state." Basically, this clause will state that rejecting the monarchy of England, the Constitution also specifically prohibits Congress from granting a title of nobility to any person and prohibits public officials from accepting a title of nobility, office, or gift from any foreign country or monarch without congressional approval. There's a whole lot more to it than that. But that's next week here on Contemplating the Constitution. Thank you very much for joining me. Once again, I hope it's interesting to you. And on MessianicLambNetwork.com or MessianicLambRadio.com, you can go on Contemplating the Constitution page and find a lot of videos. 30 plus, I think getting close to 40 videos of what we've already talked about here in order as we did the research on this. So you're welcome to go back and take a look at any or all of them. Binge watch them. We've got some good ones, some real interesting ones on different subjects. So there you go. God bless, and thank you so much for joining us on Contemplating the Constitution.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.
Eleanor Roosevelt, do solemnly swear.
I, Dwight D. Eisenhower, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States. So help me God.